Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the Flying Focus video bus. We're talking about police accountability, kind of generally about the oversight system, the one that exists now and the one that might be coming down the pike pretty soon based on a ballot measure that got passed in 2020, and a specific case of misconduct. My name is Dan Handelman. I'm with Portland Copwatch and Flying Focus Video Collective, and this case had to do with a woman whose car was stolen and an officer refused to take a report. We've been through 2 out of what were eventually 4 hearings about the case under the auspices of the Citizen Review Committee, an 11-member body of volunteers. And I said in my comments during the second meeting, which I didn't include in part 1, that the issue is the officer had the instruction in the directive to contact a supervisor if he wanted to take a police report on this stolen car. And the problem was essentially that he did not want to take the report, that he felt the paperwork that was given showing that the transfer of title was in process, which is something that's listed in the directive, wasn't sufficient, and therefore he did not have to call the supervisor. So the first person we're going to hear from at what was the second conference hearing with the CRC, where they were debating between their proposed finding of sustained and the chief's proposed finding of not sustained with the debriefing, meaning insufficient evidence. We're going to hear from Chief Chuck Lovell on how he interprets all of this.
There's just confusion on what was presented, and then 2, what would actually, a person would receive at DMV that would be proof. And the transaction notice is not that piece. And I think a lot of people get that transaction notice and feel that that is proof. And I think that's part of the confusion. So I think it's really alignment with what DMV would accept. That should be kind of really what we base our directive on.
It says the complainant provides documents from DMV indicating process of transfer of title. And I thought that's what an NOTS did, was to indicate what it was from. It's from the DMV, and it indicates that a process is in place. I'm a little confused about that. This idea that the directive is unclear, because the language is incredibly clear cut. I mean, the way it's said, I know you're using the word may, but it says one or more may be used. So it seems very clear cut. But what it seems like you're saying is that the directive doesn't kind of conform with how it works in real life.
I think most people leave DMV after making a good faith, effort to do their DMV paperwork, and they leave with a receipt, and they feel like, okay, I've got what I need. And I mean, no one knows they're going to need to report their car stolen, soon after. But I think most people get some kind of paperwork from DMV and feel like, okay, I've got, whatever I need. And then they find themselves in a situation, and it's a surprise when they figure out, oh, okay, this doesn't allow me to do X. And I think that's probably kind of what this case is.
Marion County called her. They caught the thief at the time when it was impounded. They caught the car thief. They called her. Gosh, how did they know she was the owner? And wanted the report of the stolen vehicle so they could prosecute the car thief. They had to let him go because they didn't have a theft report.
The detective who was brought in to sort of be the expert on like DMV procedures and stolen vehicle procedures said that appellant should have had a copy of the title to go along with the notice of transaction submitted form. The form itself is not proof of ownership and cannot be used as a standalone document. I don't understand how she would possibly be able to have a copy of the title, because the whole point of the notice of transaction submitted is that you're waiting for the title. So that kind of calls into question, from my perspective, the credibility of this expert that was brought in, the issue of why the officer wouldn't have called a supervisor, as one of the provisions says. And looking in the transcript of the updated interview, he said something to the effect of, no, I didn't call a supervisor because I knew what they would say. I didn't call a supervisor, to get approval to consider this sufficient documentation because I knew it was insufficient. That just seems totally to defeat the purpose of that provision to me also. It's like, if the whole point is that there might be a question about sufficiency, and then to have someone say in the interview, well, I I didn't call to get another opinion about sufficiency because I already knew it was insufficient. The whole thing just doesn't make any sense to me.
You referred to the envelope from the DMV. Is that in the case file where it's not in my copy of the case file? I just want to make sure I'm not missing it.
That's what the procedure advocate, Ms. Browning, had produced at the in-person hearing, ages ago by now is what it feels like, with the returned bill of sale from the DMV proving that appellant could not have had that document at that time.
I think
I
there
didn't
were
see it in the
additional
case file.
documents that the APA produced, and part of the reason for sending this back and doing additional work on it is that they wanted to consider the entire file in the entirety, including the new evidence that the APA had provided.
Does anyone know if a notice of transfer has ever been used as proof of ownership by the police department? No. We don't.
I'm
Okay.
not sure.
I'm trying to cram in another hour and a half long meeting into just a few minutes here for you here. So there are a lot of thoughts going on there about whether or not the paperwork was a bill of sale or a notice of transfer, and whether or not the officer was required to contact the supervisor. And the next thing you're going to hear is whether or not the officer would face serious discipline for if he got found guilty of misconduct or sustained complaint, which is what the CRC recommended. And then among the comments that are coming up, you'll hear one from a former sergeant, a retired sergeant named Leonie Reyna, who's a whistleblower who actually came to the CRC with her own complaint a few months before this hearing.
I mean, it wouldn't be, super significant like days off or firing. I mean, we'd refer to our discipline guide, and it would depend on some factors where it fell in the guide.
I looked up the discipline matrix, and it says the presumptive discipline is command counseling for failing to write a report, which is very, very, that's, pretty much the lowest, that is the lowest form of discipline. But it's below a letter of reprimand. So it is not very serious.
I'm a retired sergeant with Portland Police Bureau. I also was an expert at auto theft. It was one of my main talents in the police bureau. So I fielded a lot of stolen vehicle reports, and I took a lot of phone calls from officers like this one who came into a situation similar to this, had a credible witness or complainant, and was trying to figure out what to do with the matter. I think the DMV paperwork, as explained by a lot of folks in this meeting, was fairly credible, relatively credible. Obviously, there's no bill of sale if it got sent in. And if this case came to me as a sergeant, then I'm allowed to make a decision on whether to allow the report. So the officer could have called the sergeant. In my opinion, they should have called the sergeant. This poor victim got victimized again.
I think from my own perspective, as a Black woman, anytime I think about having to call law enforcement to my home, it is a terrifying act. Even if it's calling to report a harm against me, it's terrifying. And so at the very least, I want to feel like I'm believed when I call. And every step that can possibly be taken will be taken. And I think, in terms of most of us hold positions that if we didn't do the extra mile, the customer service aspect that Chief Lovell spoke to, a lot of us would be written up.
After the last conference, we were told that there would be a further investigation. And my understanding as well was that the police bureau was going to be looking at the documentation that was presented by the APA at the first hearing. That doesn't seem to have been done as part of the follow-up investigation. It seems like the extent of the follow-up investigation was re-interviewing the officer. Doesn't seem like they even reached out to the appellant.
For a lot of reasons stated in this discussion and the discussions before, and based on the documentary evidence provided by the appellant about whether or not she had the bill of sale in her possession at the time of her interaction with the officer, I find that a reasonable person would find that she was more credible and that her account was more credible than the officers and that the document presented falls within the directive and was an indication of ownership as an initiation of process of transfer of title. And I believe the officer failed to take reasonable steps to follow up on anything that he could have, and didn't take hardly any steps to investigate at all. And based on all of that, I think it's clear that he violated the directive.
Well, the vote is 6 in favor, 1 opposed, to, I guess, challenge the finding. So in that case, Ross, I suppose the next step is to schedule a city council hearing.
So now the CRC has voted for a third time that they think this complaint should be sustained against the officer. And Chair Avalos, when she's talking to Ross, that's Director Ross Caldwell of the Independent Police Review, the professional staff that oversees the work of the CRC, and frankly also oversees the investigation, and should have told Internal Affairs that they needed to go back and look at those documents that were presented at the previous meeting as part of the investigation, but they didn't. Now the whole case file goes in front of the City Council. As you hear, the City Attorney is going to talk about what they can and cannot consider when they're making their decision.
You should not be receiving any new evidence, as that's not allowed. And instead, you should consider only the evidence that was in the record presented to you, and there can be argument about what that evidence means.
Testimony from the appellant established that the document in appellant's possession was, in fact, the only document an individual receives from the DMV following the submission of an application to transfer title. The sole allegation at issue reads, Officer A would not take a vehicle theft report from the appellant. Officer A's responsible unit, or RU, manager reviewed the case file and recommended a finding of exonerated. Upon review, the CRC concluded that a reasonable person could not have reached that finding, and voted twice, first by a vote of 4-3, then by a vote of 6-1, to challenge the finding of exonerated and recommended a finding of sustained.
At this point, Council, you should receive the Independent Police Review's procedural history. Oh, there we go. Wonderful.
Chief Lovell disagreed with the CRC's recommended finding at a conference hearing held on August 5th, 2020, and determined further investigation was needed by the Portland Police Bureau into the applicable DMV processes. In addition, Chief Lovell's post-conference hearing memo dated August 18th, 2020, stated that, quote, the testimony and exhibits provided by both the appellant and the appellant's advocate added information to the case file that was not available to the Police Bureau when the original findings were proposed. Ensuring all reviewing entities have access to the same information is the hallmark of a thorough, complete, and unbiased investigation. Likewise, providing the involved officer the opportunity to respond to all evidence regarding the allegation is foundational in providing due process as required under law. In light of the disparity between the evidence available to the Police Bureau and the evidence available to the CRC, I have referred this case back to Internal Affairs for additional investigation. I expect Internal Affairs to collect this new information and conduct additional interviews as appropriate. I would kindly request that you do not schedule this matter to be heard before Council so that Internal Affairs may have adequate time to investigate, end quote. Therefore, as a result, a second conference hearing took place on February 3rd, 2021. The supplementary investigation conducted by the PPB into this case consisted of another interview of Officer A, during which he reiterated his position that appellant had shown him a handwritten bill of sale rather than the notice of transaction submitted, and explained that he had, quote, just skipped the whole ask a supervisor process because that would have been a no because her proof of ownership was completely insufficient, end quote. No attempt seemed to have been made to contact the appellant for another interview, nor were the documents brought forward by the appellant at the December 2019 hearing included in the updated investigative file, despite Chief Lovell's claim that Internal Affairs would be expected to consider this evidence. The updated investigative file also did not reflect any investigation into the relevant DMV processes.
I went to the DMV to find out what this NOTS was, and the frustrated and annoyed with my series of questions, employee at DMV finally said, "What's this about? Just tell me." And I briefly told him. And when I got to the point that the police officer asked for proof of ownership, he got extremely frustrated with me and said, "Well, that's the point of this form. Didn't she just hand him the Knox receipt that she should have gotten?" Which of course is exactly what she did. According to the DMV, the Knox.
Excuse me. Excuse me. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure that I'm just not recalling this being in the record, and I apologize for interrupting. We are limited to what's in the record, and so information that wasn't presented previously cannot be presented at council today, and I'm sorry to apologize, to interrupt you.
The chief referenced this, so I assumed it was in the record since he specifically asked for the investigation into the DMV process. But having been corrected, okay. So we end up with the finding that the appellant, it should have been sustained.
I want to clarify, I'm in a really awkward position here because I'm both the police commissioner and I'm a member of the city council. I have not reviewed this case previously or any aspect of this case previously, so I actually have a number of questions. There are many things about the record here that I find frankly confusing. I'm curious to know if there would be any administrative reason why the officer did not fill out the report. Has that been suggested anywhere in the record? I don't know what's involved in terms of filling that report out. Is it an onerous procedure or a non-onerous procedure? Thank you. Do you need a signature? No. Okay, thank you. You look familiar. Thank you. Sorry, Amazon showed up with a delivery.
What's in the record is excerpts from Directive 63061, which states that upon sufficient proof of ownership and indications that the vehicle has been stolen, members shall complete a general offense report. And so a report is required once a member determines that they've established ownership of the vehicle.
Okay, I think it was the advocate for the appellant that raised this issue. And if I'm wrong, I apologize. But I think she said it is an established fact that the document provided to the officer was the DMV statement. And I'm trying to figure out whether or not it was that form from the DMV or whether it was a handwritten bill of sale. Having just heard what the appellant advocate has stated into the record, help me understand as somebody who's hearing that for the first time why they're not right. It clearly says that in the absence of the other documentation, the officer must contact some supervisor. Why are you not interpreting it that way?
I don't interpret it that way because I believe there are many instances where people could try to report the vehicle stolen, where the officer has the discretion to decide it is not a stolen vehicle and not notify the supervisor or detective or sergeant. I realize the way it reads, but then to me, I don't feel the officer needs to get permission not to take a stolen vehicle report. He did run the vehicle and it came back to a different person, not the complainant. And I feel like maybe a day later or sometime past there, he could have maybe tried to contact that person and asked, did you sell the vehicle to complainant?
What constitutes a situation where an officer would need to contact their supervisor?
I think there are some cases where things are in dispute. We get a lot of times where it's kind of a civil matter, where someone has a car that was loaned to them by someone, or someone's in the process of a breakup or divorce or things of that nature. And we try to spell those out in the directive. There's rental car agreements that go past their time and things of that nature. But I think there are some instances where someone's paperwork, maybe it's really far expired, or there's some other situation where you need kind of a third party kind of supervisor to come look at it. It'd be hard to say like which kind of situations, but I think there's one where the officer genuinely believes that this person owns this car and, you know, they just don't have the sufficient paperwork, or they have some paperwork, but there's something missing or something that maybe shows someone else's name. And then the supervisor or detective can come and make that determination.
I think the language is clear, the way I interpret it. And I may be interpreting it not the way it was intended, but that's, you know, I read that sentence as a definitive, clear statement of procedure. And it says, without that proper documentation, the officer has an affirmative duty to do X, which is contact a supervisor.
I do have to fall back to how it reads. And when I think about community members, how they would read this, to me, I mean, it clearly says, in absence of the procedure to make that call. In absence of that information, we should err on the side of going, making clear we follow procedure.
So the reasonable person, Chief Lovell, I hope you'll all assume he's a reasonable person.
Yes.
Given in light of the evidence, could he have made the finding he made? Was that reasonable? And whether or not you agree with this finding.
I just wanted to make a motion that adopted the CRC committee's recommendation, but there's a first step.
Yes, because the standard put forth in the city code is deferential to the chief's finding, which is why you have to first decide, could a reasonable person make that finding that the chief made in light of the evidence, whether or not you agree with the findings. So that's the initial determination that you need to make before you get to what would you find. If you disagree and find that, no, it's not supported by the evidence, then we'll talk about the next step.
So let me help with that. Because we all think the chief is reasonable. I think where we're going with this, and correct me colleagues if I'm wrong, we disagree with the finding that the chief made, because we have a disagreement about the interpretation of paragraph H. So it's not, we're not calling the chief a liar. I want to be really, really clear on this point. We have a difference of opinion on the interpretation of H. And the majority of the council interprets that must sentence as a declarative requirement on the part of the officer.
So what you're hearing here is extraordinary. The mayor, who's the police commissioner, is saying he disagrees with the finding and he's planning to sustain this complaint against the officer. This is very important because it's never happened before. There's only been 3 other hearings in front of city council, and the mayor has never voted against the police before. And if you listen to this clip I'm going to show you before we get back to this hearing, from the 2019 hearing, Mayor Wheeler even questioned the whole structure that allows the city council to make this vote.
I have serious concerns about this process. I have concerns about having a simple majority of an elected city council being able to overturn the police commissioner, the chief, the independent police review, the internal affairs, the chief of operations, the commander, and the lieutenant on what is effectively an HR disciplinary matter.
I will move it, and Commissioner Ryan seconds it.
Ryan.
Aye.
Maps.
Aye.
Rubio.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye, the motion carries. Now what's the second part?
If the council determines that the police bureau finding is not supported by the evidence, which you did based on the directive, then you'll have a motion and vote to decide what the finding is in this case. In this case, the options that you have are unfounded, which is that the allegation was false or devoid of fact, or there was not a credible basis for a possible violation of policy or procedure. That does not sound like what I heard from you.
No.
If exonerated, again, is the act occurred but was lawful and within policy. Again, I don't think that's what I heard from you. The chief's finding was not sustained, which was the evidence was insufficient to prove a violation of policy or procedure. And then the last option is sustained, that the evidence was sufficient to prove a violation of policy or procedure.
I just wanted to reiterate that the recommendation from the CRC is to vote to sustain it. That is what we voted to do, and that's what we're recommending of council.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, I'd like to move that
that we sustain the recommendation from the CRC, which at an intuitive level means that the evidence was sufficient to prove a violation of policy or procedure.
I second that.
Please call the roll.
Ryan.
Aye.
Maps.
Aye.
Rubio.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. The motion carries. My understanding is the economic damage to the woman who owns the car or owned the car is $2,000. Is that correct?
That's the amount, almost 2,000. I think it's more like 1,900 is the lien on her for the impoundment and the towing. That's not the $13,000 for the car she lost.
The impoundment and towing, Heidi, could you look at the risk reserve, please, and see if we can help her out on that piece, please?
Yes.
That wraps it up for this two-part episode showing you the 4 hearings it took for the City Council to sustain a finding of misconduct against an officer for failing to file a police report and causing a person to lose her car. And you heard at the end there the mayor's offering to find some money to help her at least pay off the lien on the car. The reason that this case is particularly extraordinary, that the mayor voted in favor of it, goes back to the prior system where the chief could tell the City Council, thank you very much for your vote, but I don't have to do what you said, which happened several times. In the new system, as I said, which may not be in place till 2023, the citizen body should have the final say. A couple of things I didn't want to interrupt the show to talk about. When the city attorney presented the document on the screen that came from the independent police review about the investigation, normally the IPR would be there to talk to the City Council, but there's been a dispute between the auditor and the City Council, and this was very unusual that there was nobody there to read that in the record. And as you could see, you couldn't read it on the screen. I just loved the fact that the mayor was asking a question while he was at his house, and he got up to pick up a package from Amazon in the middle of the hearing. Haven't you heard of buying locally, Mr. Mayor? I hope that gives you some broad idea about how our system works now, ideas of how the new system might work in the future, and things that you might think about to make that new system work as well as it can. Again, I'm Dan Handelman with Flying Focus and Portland Copwatch, and thank you for watching.